The room smelled like polished wood and quiet arrogance when he said it. "You're just an intern." She didn't argue, didn't even look up. But somewhere between clause section 4.2 and a single silent click, the balance of power shifted, and no one noticed until it was far too late. The conference room always felt colder than the rest of the office, as if the air conditioning had been calibrated not for comfort, but for authority. Long glass walls framed a skyline that shimmered with quiet ambition, while inside, voices moved in sharp, practiced tones, measured, confident, and just a little too loud. At the far end of the table sat the CFO, fingers steepled, eyes half-lidded in the kind of attention that wasn't really attention at all. She sat closer to the door. Not by choice. Interns rarely chose their seats, but because proximity to the exit felt like a silent agreement. "You are temporary." Her laptop was open, notes aligned with precision, every line clean and intentional. She listened more than she spoke, which made her nearly invisible. "Nearly. Let's not overcomplicate this," the CFO said, his voice slicing through a discussion about a contract revision. "We're already behind schedule, and the regulator won't care about our internal debates." He leaned back slightly, scanning the room as if expecting nods, not questions. He got them. There was a pause, brief, almost polite, before she spoke. Not loudly, not even assertively, just enough to exist in the space. "Clause section 4.2 might need a second look," she said, her voice steady. "The liability language seems misaligned with the reporting thresholds." For a moment, no one reacted. Then came a soft chuckle from somewhere to her left. The CFO didn't laugh. He just turned his head, slow and deliberate, like a door closing. "You're just an intern," he said, not unkindly, but with the finality of a stamp. "Don't touch contracts." The words settled into the room like dust. Fine, pervasive, impossible to ignore. Someone shifted in their chair. Another glanced at their screen, suddenly very busy. The meeting moved on, as meetings do, swallowing the moment whole. But something lingered. She didn't respond, didn't defend her point or repeat it louder. Instead, she nodded once, a small, almost invisible motion, and returned her gaze to the laptop screen. Her fingers hovered for a second, then resumed their quiet rhythm, typing, scrolling, annotating. If anyone had looked closely, they might have noticed the way her eyes narrowed slightly, not in frustration, but in focus. 2 paragraphs later in the document, section 4.2 sat there, unassuming, wrapped in legal language that felt heavier than it looked. The clause referenced reporting thresholds tied to a sum that had been adjusted in a previous version, but not here. A mismatch. Subtle. Easy to miss if you trusted the flow more than the details. She didn't trust the flow. Around her, the meeting continued its steady march. Numbers, projections, timelines. The CFO spoke again, this time about exposure limits, his tone confident, almost reassuring. People nodded, pens moved, slides changed. And still, she kept reading. Every few lines, something didn't quite align. A phrase echoed differently than it should have. A definition shifted, just slightly, like a reflection in imperfect glass. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't obvious, but it was there, threading through the contract like a quiet warning. She opened the previous version, compared, cross-referenced. Her screen became a mosaic of windows, each one holding a piece of something that didn't quite fit. The sum, there it was again. Referenced in a footnote, updated in an appendix, but in section 4.2. Unchanged. A small thing, someone might say. But small things, she knew, were where the real risks like to hide. The meeting ended with the usual choreography, chairs sliding back, muted conversations, the CFO already halfway to his next obligation. No one stopped her. No one asked what she thought. She closed her laptop slowly, as if sealing something inside it. Back at her desk, the office felt different. Less formal, more alive, but also more chaotic. Notifications blinked. Phones rang. Someone laughed too loudly near the printer. She sat down, opened the contract again, and let the noise fade into the background. Clause Section 4.2. She read it once more, this time not as an intern, not as someone expected to observe, but as someone responsible for understanding. The language was precise, but precision can be misleading when it's built on outdated assumptions. The reporting threshold referenced a sum that had been revised elsewhere, raised significantly. But here, in this clause, it remained tied to the old figure, which meant something else entirely. If triggered, the clause would require disclosure under conditions that no longer matched the current structure. It wouldn't just be a technical inconsistency, it could draw attention, the kind of attention that regulators didn't ignore. Her cursor blinked at the edge of the paragraph, patient, waiting. She hesitated, not because she doubted the issue, but because she understood the weight of touching something she'd been told not to touch. The CFO's voice echoed, calm and dismissive. Don't touch contracts. But the contract was already speaking. She made the edit carefully. No flourish, no commentary, just alignment. The threshold updated. The language adjusted to match the rest of the document. Clean, quiet, correct. Then she added a note. Brief, neutral. Adjusted section 4.2 to reflect updated reporting threshold. She didn't send it immediately. Instead, she reviewed the entire section again, tracing the implications forward and backward, making sure nothing else unraveled because of this one thread. It didn't. In fact, everything held together better, tighter, more coherent. Only then did she attach the revised version to an internal message. No urgency in the subject line, no emphasis, just a routine update sent into the same system that carried dozens of others every hour. She clicked Send. For a moment, nothing happened. The office continued its rhythm, indifferent to small corrections. A colleague asked about lunch plans. Someone complained about a spreadsheet. The world didn't shift. But somewhere, in the quiet architecture of that contract, something had changed. And the change was already moving. Morning arrived with the kind of deceptive calm that offices specialize in. Coffee machines humming, keyboards clicking, conversations floating just above a whisper. Nothing in the air suggested that a single line in a contract had already begun to ripple outward, threading its way through systems, inboxes, and unseen checkpoints. She arrived early, not out of habit, but because something in her mind refused to settle. The edit to section 4.2 had been small, almost invisible, yet it lingered like a question left half-answered. She placed her bag under the desk, powered on her laptop, and opened the contract again. Not to change it, but to watch it, as if it might reveal what came next. Across the office, the CFO hadn't arrived yet. His chair remained empty, a silent placeholder for authority, but his presence was already implied. In the neatly stacked reports on his desk, in the calendar reminders that blinked across shared systems, in the quiet tension that seemed to organize itself around his eventual entrance. An email notification appeared. Subject: Regulatory Inquiry. File reference. Her eyes paused on the line for a fraction longer than usual. Not urgency, recognition. The sender was external, a regulator. The kind that didn't send messages without a reason, and certainly not this early. She didn't open it, not yet. Instead, she watched as the same subject line began to appear across other screens. One manager frowned slightly. Another leaned closer to their monitor. A whisper moved through the room, subtle but unmistakable, the kind that precedes attention. Then the CFO walked in. He didn't notice the shift at first. He rarely did. Confidence has a way of filtering out anything that doesn't immediately demand it. He placed his briefcase down, adjusted his cuffs, and glanced at his inbox with practiced efficiency. And then, he stopped. Just for a second. It was barely visible, that pause. A flicker. But it was enough. "What is this?" he said, not loudly, but with a tone that carried. Conversations thinned. Chairs stopped moving. The office, so recently alive with small distractions, began to narrow its focus. No one answered immediately, because everyone was reading. The regulator's request was precise. It referenced a file tied to a sum, $2 million. It cited reporting thresholds. It asked for documentation, justification, authorship. Not in broad terms, but in language that suggested familiarity. As if the document had already been seen, already been understood, and now required explanation. Her cursor blinked again. She opened the email. The wording was exact. Clause section 4.2 was mentioned explicitly. Not questioned, not challenged, but acknowledged. The threshold aligned. The reporting condition triggered. The request followed. Her breath didn't change, but something in her posture did. An almost imperceptible stillness, like a surface settling after a drop of water. Across the room, the CFO stood up. "Who finalized this contract?" he asked, scanning faces, not waiting for volunteers. His voice was sharper now, edged with something that hadn't been there yesterday. Not anger, yet, but proximity to it. A manager cleared his throat. "It went through standard review. Legal signed off." "Then why is the regulator referencing section 4.2 like it's a trigger point?" The CFO pressed. "This wasn't supposed to escalate at that threshold." Silence answered him. Because the contract, quiet, precise, recently aligned, no longer behaved the way assumptions expected it to. She didn't speak. Instead, she opened the version history. There it was. The edit. Time-stamped. Documented. Not hidden, not emphasized. Just present. A single adjustment that had brought the clause into alignment with the rest of the contract. Nothing more, nothing less. Footsteps approached. The legal counsel entered the room, summoned or perhaps drawn by the same email. Calm, composed, carrying a folder that suggested preparation rather than surprise. "I've reviewed the request," counsel said, placing the folder on the table. "The regulator is correct. The clause is consistent with the updated reporting threshold. The trigger is valid." The CFO's expression tightened, not in confusion, but in recalibration. "That clause wasn't adjusted in the last revision," he said. "It should still reflect the previous threshold." A pause. Counsel opened the folder, glanced at a printed page, then looked up, not at the CFO, but slightly past him. "It was adjusted," counsel said evenly. The room seemed to hold its breath. "By whom?" the CFO asked. Not loudly. But this time, the question didn't leave space for deflection. Counsel didn't rush the answer. He turned a page, as if confirming something that was already clear, then spoke with the kind of neutrality that carries weight precisely because it doesn't try to. "The author of the final contract revision," he said, "is her." For a moment, no one moved. Not because they didn't understand, but because understanding arrived all at once, without preparation. Eyes shifted. Not dramatically, not in unison, but enough. Enough to redraw the map of the room, to reposition someone who had been, until now, near the door. She didn't look up immediately. Her screen still displayed the clause. Section 4.2. Clean, aligned, exact. When she did lift her gaze, it wasn't to meet the CFO's eyes, but to acknowledge the silence itself, a space that had changed shape around a single quiet decision. No one spoke, because in that silence, something undeniable had surfaced. Not loud, not confrontational, but precise. And precision, once revealed, is difficult to ignore. The email remained open. The regulator's request waited. The sum, $2 million, sat there, no longer abstract, now tied to a clause that held. And somewhere beneath the surface of that moment, a new question began to form. One that hadn't been asked yet, but soon would be. What else had been overlooked? If this moment surprised you, imagine what comes next. Subscribe to follow the story and share your thoughts below. The silence didn't shatter. It stretched. It clung to the edges of the conference room like condensation on glass, blurring outlines, distorting certainty. No one rushed to fill it. Not the CFO, who now stood with one hand resting on the back of his chair, as if anchoring himself. Not the managers, whose earlier confidence had folded into careful stillness. And not her. She closed the email. Not abruptly, not dramatically. Just a soft click, as though placing a bookmark in something that wasn't finished yet. Then she aligned her notes, one corner to another, the way people do when they need the world to make sense again, at least on paper. "Walk me through the change," the CFO said finally. His voice had lost its earlier sharpness, not softer exactly, but more precise, as if each word had been weighed before release. Authority, when challenged, doesn't always get louder. Sometimes it becomes quieter in a way that demands even more attention. She didn't rush. The contract was updated in multiple sections. She began, her tone even, almost conversational. The reporting threshold was revised to reflect the new exposure structure, but Section 4.2 still referenced the previous amount. A pause, not for effect, but for clarity. "So I aligned it." Across the table, someone shifted. "Aligned it?" the CFO repeated, as if testing the word for hidden implications. "Without approval?" The question hung there, not accusatory, not yet, but heavy enough to tilt the air. She met it without resistance. "I added a note in the revision log," she said. "Standard internal process. No structural changes, just consistency across clauses." 2 paragraphs into the conversation, something subtle began to change. Not in her tone, which remained steady. Not in her posture, still composed. But in the way the room listened. Earlier, her voice had been background, optional. Now it carried definition. Edges. Counsel stepped forward slightly, opening the folder again. "She's correct," he said, tapping the printed page with a finger that didn't hesitate. The contract had an inconsistency. If left unchanged, it would have created a discrepancy between reported and actual thresholds. The CFO's gaze shifted, from counsel back to her, then briefly to the skyline beyond the glass, as if recalculating something larger than the room itself. "And the regulator?" he asked. "They're responding to the corrected version," counsel replied, "which means the document now reflects the true reporting trigger. That's why the $2 million file was requested." Another pause. This one deeper, because the implication wasn't loud, but it was undeniable. If the clause had remained untouched, the trigger might have gone unnoticed. Or worse, misinterpreted. The regulator's attention, delayed or redirected, could have surfaced later, under less controlled conditions. The kind of conditions that don't come with early warnings. She didn't say that. She didn't need to. 3 paragraphs into the exchange, a quiet tension threaded through the room. Not hostile, not chaotic, but charged with recognition. The contract, once just another document in a long chain of approvals, had become something else entirely. A mirror, perhaps, reflecting not just what was written, but what had been assumed. The CFO exhaled slowly. "Next time," he said, choosing each word with care, "you flag it before making the change." Not a reprimand, not quite approval either, something in between. She nodded. Understood. But there was a difference now. Subtle, almost intangible, but real. The nod wasn't about agreement alone. It was acknowledgement of a boundary that had shifted, even if no one had formally redrawn it. Across the table, one of the managers leaned forward slightly. "How did you catch it?" he asked, curiosity slipping through the edges of caution. She glanced at her screen again, as if the answer still lived there. "The language didn't match the logic," she said. "The numbers told a different story than the clause. It just didn't align." A simple explanation, But in its simplicity, something else surfaced. The kind of attention that doesn't rely on titles or permissions. The kind that sees what others move past. The CFO straightened. "We respond to the regulator today," he said, shifting the focus back to action. "Full documentation, no delays." Heads nodded. Laptops reopened. The room began to move again, but not in the same way as before. The rhythm had changed, slightly offbeat, more deliberate. She returned to her seat near the door. But the door didn't feel as close anymore. Her inbox blinked. A new message. Subject: Documentation request. Supporting files. She opened it. Attachments listed. References cross-linked. A follow-up question embedded in the text. Specific, targeted, pointing not just to Section 4.2, but to how it connected with another clause deeper in the contract. Her eyes narrowed slightly. Because that clause, it hadn't been part of the discussion, not yet. And the way it was phrased, precise, almost anticipatory, suggested something else entirely. The regulator wasn't just reacting, they were tracing. She leaned back, just a fraction, letting the realization settle. Not as alarm, but as awareness. The contract wasn't a static object anymore. It was being read, interpreted, examined from angles that hadn't been visible inside the room. And somewhere within it, another thread was beginning to pull. She scrolled. Found the clause. Read it once. Then again. The alignment held, but something adjacent shifted, like a shadow moving just outside direct light. She didn't speak. Not yet. Because this time, the question wasn't about what had been corrected. It was about what might surface next. By midday, the office had lost its morning composure. It wasn't chaos, not the loud, obvious kind, but something subtler, like a rhythm slightly out of sync. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Screens were checked twice, then a third time. Even the usual hum of routine felt thinner, as if stretched over something sharper beneath. She stayed at her desk. The new message from the regulator remained open, its language precise in a way that didn't invite interpretation. It referenced the additional clause again, this time with a request for clarification on its interaction with Section 4.2. Not a contradiction, not an error, just a question that assumed the answer already existed, which meant one thing. They had seen more than the obvious. 2 paragraphs into her review, she noticed it. Not in the clause itself, it was technically sound, but in the way it connected to a definition buried earlier in the contract. A definition that had been updated during negotiations, adjusted to accommodate a revised structure, but never fully propagated across every reference point. A gap. Not large enough to trigger alarms on its own, but wide enough to create ambiguity under scrutiny. She leaned forward slightly, her fingers resting on the keyboard without moving. Around her, the office continued its careful balancing act. Calls taken in hushed tones, documents opened and closed, decisions made with an extra layer of hesitation. The CFO's door was now closed. That alone said enough. 3 paragraphs into the silence of her own focus, the pieces began to align. The regulator's question wasn't random. It followed a path, Section 4.2 to the adjacent clause, from there to the definition, and from the definition to the structure that governed how the $2 million sum was interpreted. A chain. Logical, intentional. They were mapping the contract, and the map wasn't complete. She opened the earlier drafts. Version after version unfolded across her screen, each one carrying traces of decisions made under time pressure, negotiated in fragments, approved in layers. The definition had changed, subtly but significantly. And while most clauses had adapted, this one had remained just slightly out of step. Not wrong, but not fully aligned either. Her cursor hovered. This wasn't the same as before. Section 4.2 had been a clear inconsistency, visible once you looked. This, however, was different. It required interpretation, judgment, and more importantly, permission. She exhaled slowly. Across the office, a chair rolled back. Someone whispered her name, then thought better of it. The atmosphere had shifted again, not toward tension this time, but toward expectation, as if the room itself had begun to recognize a pattern, even if no one said it out loud. She clicked into the clause. Read it carefully. Then moved to the definition. Back again. The mismatch wasn't dramatic, just enough to allow two interpretations where there should have been one. Under normal circumstances, it might have passed unnoticed, but under regulatory attention, precision mattered. And precision, once questioned, demanded an answer. Her screen reflected faintly in the glass wall beside her, layers of text overlapping with the city beyond. For a moment, it felt like looking at two realities at once, one structured, controlled, the other unpredictable, shifting. She made a note, not an edit, a comment. Clarify linkage between Clause X and updated definition to ensure consistency with reporting structure. Neutral, observational, careful. She didn't send it, not yet. 4 paragraphs into the unfolding moment, footsteps approached again, but slower this time. Measured. The CFO stepped out of his office. His expression was composed, but not untouched. The earlier certainty had been replaced by something more deliberate, attention sharpened by necessity. He scanned the room, then stopped when his gaze reached her desk. "Any updates?" he asked. The question was directed broadly, but it landed specifically. She turned her screen slightly, not fully, just enough. "There's a secondary inconsistency," she said. "Not in Section 4.2, but in how another clause references the updated definition." A brief silence. "Impact?" he asked. "Potential ambiguity under regulatory interpretation," she replied. "It doesn't break the structure, but it weakens it." The CFO stepped closer, not looming, not dismissive, closer. "Can it be fixed?" he asked. She paused. Because this time, the answer wasn't just technical. "It can be clarified," she said, "but it should go through formal review." 2 paragraphs later, something shifted again. Not in the words, in the space between them. He nodded once. "Prepare the note," he said. "We'll route it through legal. Simple, direct." And yet, the same person who had said, "Don't touch contracts," now stood here, asking her to shape the next step. No announcement marked the change. No acknowledgement framed it. But it was there, clear as the text on her screen. She nodded. "I'll draft it." He didn't leave immediately. For a second, it seemed like he might say something else. Clarify, reinforce, perhaps even retract what had been said the day before. He didn't. Instead, he turned and walked back toward his office, the door closing behind him with a softer sound than before. 5 paragraphs into the quiet that followed, the office resumed its motion, but not its old rhythm. This one was steadier, more aware. She opened a new document, started writing, each word placed with intention, each sentence balancing clarity with restraint. Not rewriting the contract, just reinforcing its structure, closing the gap that had revealed itself under scrutiny. The regulator's message remained open beside it. Waiting. Because this time, the response wouldn't just answer a question, it would define how the contract held. Under pressure, under review, under the kind of attention that doesn't miss details twice. And somewhere within that process, another realization began to form. Not about the contract. Not about the regulator, but about the quiet, shifting line between who is expected to see and who actually does. Следующая глава, Etap 6, Glava 5. By late afternoon, the light in the office had changed. The sharp brightness of midday softened into long reflections across glass and polished surfaces, turning screens into mirrors and people into silhouettes of motion. The day hadn't slowed, but it had deepened. Decisions now carried weight, not just urgency. Her draft was ready, not long, not elaborate, just precise. Like the clause that had started it all. She had outlined the ambiguity, traced its origin, and proposed a clarification that didn't alter intent, but removed the possibility of misinterpretation. Clean language. No excess. She read it once more. Then, once again. Across the room, conversations had become quieter, more contained. The CFO's door remained closed, but not in isolation, in focus. Legal had moved into one of the smaller meeting rooms, papers spread out like coordinates on a map no one wanted to misread. She stood up, not abruptly, with intention. The short walk across the office felt longer than usual, each step measured against the quiet awareness that now followed her. Not attention in the obvious sense, no one stared, but there was a shift, subtle and undeniable, like a current changing direction beneath still water. She knocked once. "Come in." The CFO looked up as she entered, legal counsel seated beside him, both of them already mid-discussion. The atmosphere in the room was different from the morning, not tense, not defensive, focused, aligned. "I have the clarification note," she said, placing the document on the table. No explanation, no framing, just the work. Counsel reached for it first, read silently, then again, slower. The CFO watched, not the document, but counsel's expression, as if reading the reaction before the content. A pause. Not long, but enough. "This works," counsel said. 2 words. Calm. Definitive. The kind of approval that doesn't need decoration. The CFO exhaled, quietly, almost imperceptibly. "Root it," he said. "We include this in the response to the regulator." She nodded. Turned to leave. "Wait." She paused at the door, not tense, not uncertain, just still. The CFO didn't speak immediately. For a moment, it seemed like the room itself was deciding whether this was just another step, or something more. Then, "Next time," he said, his tone measured, "you bring it up in the meeting." Not a correction, not quite praise, but different. She met his gaze briefly. "I did," she said. A beat, not defiant, not emotional, just factual. Something in the air shifted, again. Counsel glanced between them, then back to the document, as if choosing not to interrupt a moment that didn't need commentary. The CFO nodded once. This time, without adding anything. She left the room, closed the door gently behind her. Back at her desk, the office felt clearer. Not quieter, not calmer, but more defined. Her screen still held the contract, now layered with revisions, notes, confirmations. A document that had begun as routine had revealed its edges, its tensions, its hidden alignments. And now, it held. An email notification appeared. From legal. Subject: Final submission, regulator response. She opened it. The document was attached, complete, structured, precise. Her clarification integrated seamlessly. No markers, no emphasis. Just part of the whole. Below, a single line. Filed. She leaned back slightly. Not in relief, in recognition. Because the outcome wasn't loud. No announcements echoed through the office. No one stood up to applaud. The day continued. Calls resumed. Messages sent. Deadlines chased. But something had settled. Not just in the contract, in the room. 2 paragraphs later, as the sun dipped lower, casting the skyline in warm tones that softened even the sharpest edges, a quiet conversation unfolded near the printer. "She caught it?" "Yeah." A pause. Then, "Good thing she did." No names, no titles, just acknowledgement. She closed her laptop, not because the work was finished, but because this part of it was. As she gathered her things, her reflection caught briefly in the glass wall again. This time, it didn't feel like 2 separate realities, just one, clearer, more aligned. And as she stepped toward the door, the same door she had once sat beside, close enough to leave unnoticed, it didn't feel like an exit anymore. It felt like a threshold she had already crossed. By the time evening settled over the city, the office had softened into something almost reflective. The sharp edges of the day blurred into warm light and long shadows, as if even the building itself needed a moment to process what had just unfolded. Screens dimmed, chairs emptied, voices lowered, but the after effect of precision lingered, quiet and undeniable. She stayed a little longer, not because she had to, because she wanted to see the final shape of things. The regulator's response had already been filed. The contract, revised, clarified, aligned, now existed as a complete structure, no longer fragile in its details. It held under scrutiny, not by accident, but because someone had cared enough to notice where it didn't. Her inbox chimed again. Subject: Acknowledgement, received. She opened it. The regulator's message was brief, almost understated. Confirmation of receipt, review in progress. No additional questions, for now. But the tone had shifted. It no longer probed. It observed, which meant something subtle but significant. The document spoke clearly enough to stand on its own. She let out a slow breath. Across the room, the CFO stepped out of his office once more. Without the urgency of earlier, his movements seemed more deliberate, less reactive. He paused near a desk, exchanged a few words, then continued, until he reached hers. Good work today, he said, simple, direct. And yet, it carried more weight than his earlier dismissal. She looked up, meeting his gaze without hesitation. Thank you. No irony, no tension, just acknowledgement. 2 paragraphs later, he added, almost as an afterthought, but not quite. We'll loop you into contract reviews going forward. There it was. Not an apology, not a correction, a shift. Formal, quiet, but irreversible. She nodded once. Understood. He moved on, already returning to the rhythm of decisions that would now, inevitably, include her. The office continued its slow unwind. Lights dimmed in sections. Conversations turned lighter, less guarded. Someone laughed again, this time without restraint. But beneath it all, something had changed. Not loudly, not visibly, but structurally. 3 paragraphs into the quiet of her final moments at the desk, she reopened the contract one last time. Not to check for errors, not to revise, just to see it. Section 4.2 sat there, steady, aligned, no longer a loose thread waiting to be pulled. The adjacent clause, now clarified, fit into place like it had always belonged. Definitions matched. Logic flowed. The sum, $2 million, no longer hovered as a risk, but stood as a clear, accountable figure. She closed the document, this time without hesitation. Because the work didn't need watching anymore. It could stand. She gathered her things, the small rituals of departure grounding the day into something complete. Laptop closed, notebook aligned, pen placed exactly where it belonged. Outside, the city lights had begun to flicker on, each one a quiet signal of continuity. At the door, she paused. Not out of uncertainty, out of awareness. The same threshold she had crossed earlier now felt different again, not because it had changed, but because she had. The distance between just an intern and something more wasn't marked by titles or announcements. It was marked by moments like this, where precision spoke, where silence carried meaning, where a single clause could redraw the map of a room. She stepped out, and the door closed behind her, not as an ending, but as something cleaner, sharper. A line drawn, not to separate, but to define.